This is Jim Semivan, and you are listening to That UFO Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and I am joined today by a filmmaker, FOIA student, UFO enthusiast, and citizen activist all the way on the other side of the world. I'd like to welcome host of the Unexplained Rundown, Grant Lavac. Grant, welcome to the podcast.
Andy, it's good to be with you, my friend. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
It's good to have you on. You're one of those folks, Grant, that I rely on social media for certain aspects of my UFO news or updates, especially from over the other side of the world, as you are. Based in Australia, I'd like you to, for those who aren't on social media, who might be listening to you for the first time, give them a little bit of a rundown as to who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Sydney. I live in Melbourne, Australia now with my wife, my little one, 3.5-year-old, and have always had a fascination and interest in obviously the UAP, UFO topic since I was a little fella. And it was actually when I was around about 7-8 years of age, my dad took me to a photo exhibition, a UFO photo exhibition, and I only learnt earlier this year, actually it was last year, that veteran UAP Australian researcher Bill Chalker was responsible for organising that particular photo exhibition. So that was a kind of like a 6 degrees of separation with Bill. But that was really what sparked my interest. This photo exhibition had all these, black and white blow-ups of famous UFOs over the years, and one of them was the McMinnville photo, the famous McMinnville photo. And I remember just staring at that photo for what felt like 10, 15 minutes, just losing myself in that photo altogether. And then as I grew up as a teenager, come every Wednesday night at 9 p.m., you'd have the X-Files, and then you'd do a big debrief with your schoolmates the next day. So I always had an active interest in the topic and sci-fi growing up as a little fella, and then my teenage years. And then, like I guess a lot of folks, it wasn't until the 2017 articles came out in the New York Times that really piqued my interest. And then throughout COVID, I kind of became a sponge again on the topic, and was listening to more and more podcasts, and with everything that was ramping up with the activity that was ramping up in the US, it got me thinking, well, what is Australia doing about this whole topic, considering how far the ball has moved since 2017 in the States? And unfortunately, the Australian government Department of Defence is doing very little on this topic, but that's kind of been my driving force now for the last couple of years, is to try and engage my elected representatives and folks in government to try and move the needle along and get them to take the topic seriously and treat it with the respect that it deserves, rather than ridicule it and play the ignorance is bliss card. So that's kind of a bit of a quick summary as to my history on the topic.
Nice. I think a lot of listeners will appreciate it, and it's similar to myself that you had that interest as a kid, and that just kind of carried on. And 2020, COVID, bit of a wild time for everyone, and some of us started podcasts, blogs, YouTube shows, just getting more active on social media. And it's that kind of new, I don't want to sound really old or big-headed either, but new generation or new age of UFO folks coming through. Because I think for so long there had been so many amazing researchers, but there seems to be like a massive gap in ages between there was folks that they were getting older, and really unfortunately people like Stanton Friedman and others, pass away, and it was like who was coming in to take their place. And it's great to see that folks all around the world are now potentially going to be those folks in years to come. And you look at yourself, and I'm not saying it's going to be you, Grant, but you picked up that niche in Australia where there was a gap for UFO researchers and people coming forward to talk about the topic, especially on social media. Unless there's people that I've missed, you're one of the folks I've seen in Australia, short of a Ross Coulthart, we'll get to, who's really picked up the ball and ran with it. And even doing that dirty work, that boots on the ground, I'm going to write to politicians, I'm going to tell folks that they should be writing to politicians, that wasn't being done. So, thumbs up for that kind of work.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I mean, really, I continue to stand on the shoulders of giants like Bill Chalker, Keith Basterfield, Ross Coulthart. I've learned a lot from John Greenwald, with what he's done with his great work for decades now with FOIA. So that's why I say throughout COVID, I just became a sponge and just threw myself into the topic, trying to learn as much as I could from as many as I could, and just kind of fell into this niche of, there's not many folks asking the sorts of questions that have interested me on, why isn't Australia taking this topic seriously? Why are they so reluctant to engage our US ally and Five Eyes partner on this topic when, you have US and Canada being quite open with their communication and transparent with how they're taking the topic seriously. So, and I think we're kind of live in a privileged day and age with the advent of social media. I mean, Stanton Friedman and those guys from decades past, they really had just the UFO conferences to go to and maybe small community groups and those sorts of things. We're really in a position now where information is just at the speed of a tweet, or I don't know what you call the equivalent it is with X now. But
I still stick with tweet, but I know what you mean.
But I mean, you have the YouTubes and the podcast platforms and Spotify and Twitter and Facebook, and you're just able to not just access information so much more faster and it's so much more readily accessible than it has been ever before, but you have the opportunity to engage with like-minded people. Those that aren't like-minded, you don't have to live in an echo chamber. You can have constructive conversations and agree to disagree with folks that share different opinions, which is what I really enjoy. I don't always see eye to eye with people that I engage with on social media, and that's perfectly fine. Everyone has their own belief systems and opinions, and I try and stay as neutral as I possibly can throughout my exploration and journey on this topic and research, and let the information, the data lead me whichever ways it goes. And I've said this so many times on other conversations that I've had with people that my mind is kind of almost constantly changing on this topic, because one week you'll hear one bit of information and the next week you'll hear something different. It moves the needle back and forth for me all the time. So I am very much down the middle a lot of the time on this topic. And the big driving force for me, which I said before, is Australia is yet to even acknowledge that a conversation needs to be had on this topic. And a quote that I've stolen a few times from Ross Coulthart is, he says, all we want is for UAP to be not acknowledged, for it to be investigated, and a conclusion reached as to what UAP are. And so for Australia, we're not even at the stage yet of acknowledging that the conversation needs to be had on the topic. So sadly, Australia is decades behind the US on the topic. And we share that common ground that the UK and Australia, unfortunately, are still very much mum on the topic and don't want to talk about it, don't want to touch it, which is really frustrating considering our US ally and Five Eyes partner is taking it so seriously.
Yeah, UAP in the UK and Australia, like you say, stands for unacknowledged phenomenon. if I can ruin that, and I wonder though, that's in a political sense, in a mainstream media sense, it's very much still a taboo subject, full of stigma. Where are the Aussie people at though right now? If I sent you to your place of work, or like your typical office, your typical supermarket, and Grant Lavac walked about doing the Vox Pops thing with a microphone, asking the general public, tell us about UFOs, what do you know? What's that conversation sounding like?
I was, again, at the start of COVID, when I was kind of really deep diving on this topic, I was a bit reluctant to share my fascination, or as what my wife would call obsession, maybe with this topic. Marriage and the UAP topic don't always go hand in hand, by the way, for folks that are out there. But no, I mean, and being from Sydney, I travel up to Sydney, or used to travel up to Sydney fairly frequently, pre-COVID and after restrictions lifted, because Melbourne had one of the worst restrictions on the planet. Couldn't do anything. But I traveled to Sydney, and I've shared this story before, but I was going through the security checkpoint, and I was doing some research at the time on Kurt Russell's encounter with the Phoenix Lights, and I did a whole video documentary on that. And the security checkpoint officer went through my carry-on luggage, and I had Lynn Kitai's book on the Phoenix Lights, and he pulled it out, and before you know it, we were just having a random informal conversation on the Phoenix Lights and then the topic. And he continued to kind of check bags as they were coming through, and 10 minutes later we're still having a conversation on the topic, just very light, nothing. You're wearing your tinfoil hat and woo. So I've had more of those conversations in the last 2 years than I have many years before. So I think people are a lot more open to having the conversation on the topic with everything that's been happening in the last 5-6 years. I don't think Australia, unfortunately, is always, living down under. We're always a little bit behind with everything, and the media is certainly no different there. They're still very lackluster in their coverage on the topic. So I would say that a lot of Aussies probably don't have the knowledge or know what is even happening on the topic. One, as much as we do, because we're heavily invested in learning what's happening day to day, researching it. And obviously our friends across the pond in the United States, there is coverage on this topic, almost daily. News Nation, to their credit, is covering this more than any other network. So they're really leading the charge. But Australia's really not there. We have a couple of the breakfast shows that will cover breaking developments in the US, and they'll always bloody play the X-Files at the front end of a segment, which really still frustrates me, because they're still taking the piss out of the topic. They're just not taking it seriously. And so I've got a gripe with the legacy media in Australia, but I think that's why probably not many Australians are actually either fully aware of the topic or not taking it seriously, because the media is choosing not to cover it. And it's just been treated with ridicule and stigma within the government, as well as within the Australian Department of Defence. So, if you walked up to someone on the streets in Australia that really had no interest on the topic, I think they'd probably be open to having a conversation with you, because I'm sure they've heard inklings and rumours about what's been happening in the US, but they just don't know the extent of it as we do and our friends across the pond. So I think people are more open to having the conversation about it now, and it not always turning into a little green men or aliens discussion. And I've never actually come at it from a non-human intelligence or ET hypothesis perspective. I've always positioned it as, well, the US has told us that UAP are real and that they pose a potential national security threat and safety of flight risk. Well, that's the same. They're the same concerns that Australian government and Australian Department of Defence should have. We're not even going down the path of, well, let's talk NHI and what David Grusch has kind of revealed in testimony in Congress. Australia's not even at that point yet. Again, we haven't even acknowledged that the conversation needs to be had from a national security perspective and safety of flight risk. So that's, again, where I've been coming at it from, is just on that national security and safety of flight perspective.
How was that David Grusch story picked up on? And not to forget, Ryan Graves and David Fravor were there, but we've said numerous times, Grusch was the story that came from the UFO hearings. That's what the international media picked up on. They almost forgo the fact that Ryan Graves and David Fravor were there, because David Grusch was blockbuster. He was the clips, he was the sound bites, because of what he was saying, that language of non-human biologics, talking about bodies, talking about craft. It was that was the headlines, and understandably so. How did that land in Australia? Was it like you say, it hit the breakfast shows, bang, US whistleblower comes forward, X-Files music, and then it was gone the next day?
Pretty much, yeah. They didn't even touch on, I don't recall seeing any coverage that even touched on Ryan Graves and David Fravor's testimony, which I actually found, I thought those guys were great in that they really hit it out of the ballpark, that this is such a national security and safety flight issue that needs to be addressed, because there's a huge domain awareness gap. I found their testimony to be as compelling, or just as compelling as the sincerity that David Grusch was coming at it from. But, of course, David Fravor and Ryan Graves got no coverage in the media in Australia, because it's not fantastical enough. It wasn't it wasn't as clickbaity as breakfast shows and the newspaper and the online media wanted to be. So David Grusch certainly got some coverage with his testimony and claims, but again, like you said, it's always kind of been positioned with the little tinfoil hat or the stigma attached to it with the X-Files playing, or always a reference to Martians or tiny green men and that sort of thing, which is, we're so past that point. It's just so frustrating that there still seems to be those folks that laugh into their hands when they hear people talk about the topic in the media. And, the classic example with that we just saw in the last couple of days, the Republican presidential, candidate debate.
Yeah.
You had Chris Christie getting asked a question, and the audience resorts to laughter, and it just puts a big needle in the balloon and fizzles it out, so that people go back to just treating it with ridicule and ignorant on how important the topic is, and how concerned people within the US Congress are really taking this issue.
Yeah, and I think with that whole perception as reality when it comes to the media and how the media report things is very much how most of the populace take their news, and they take that as gospel. And for anyone who hadn't seen it, just to expand on it slightly, Christie gets asked a question by the host of the panel on stage of all the representatives and candidates, and she says, the UFO question, and she asks it in a reasonable manner, to be fair, but as she's asking it, the camera keeps cutting to Christie, who does the guffaw and oh really, I'm getting the UFO question, you're going to give me that question, and kind of laughs it off. The audience laughs, and she tries her best to ask the question, so nothing against the host in that respect, but like you say, at that point, that kills a lot of momentum for people who may have been going, the UFOs question's getting asked now, it's a joke, okay, yeah, so I'm not interested anymore. That's how that works for most people, and that's where I've said many times, Grant, and some people agree, some don't, and that, like you say, that's fine. Social media and UFO Twitter, UFO X, whatever you want to call it, isn't the world, media. It's a very small bubble of folks all having conversations back and forward, and just because we view certain things or we retweet the same people, we have these interesting debates or interesting points of view. No one else is seeing that outside of a relatively small bubble.
You're 100% right. It is, and it's so unfortunate that that I think. So Nikki Haley, who's running as a Republican, she was asked also a couple of months back, I think, in an interview about the UAP topic, and she openly admitted that she wasn't well versed on it. She hadn't been briefed. She hadn't really spent any time, exploring it as an issue that might be on the on the presidential debates. But now clearly it is a question that has been asked, and hopefully you would want to think with some of the other debates that are yet to come, with maybe other moderators and hosts that are asking questions in a more pertinent manner. I think that's not the last question that we're going to see. And someone that I've really admired in the last couple of months from the journalist field, Chris Cuomo. I think he's really done a great job on News Nation to bring himself up to speed on the topic, and he's asked some really, I think, interesting and relevant questions. He's had Ross Coulthart on a number of times. He's interviewed. I think he had Jeremy Corbell on his podcast only recently, and he's a smart cat, and he asked some really interesting questions on the topic. So if there are more people like him that are going to be moderating these presidential nominee and presidential debates going forward, I think they're the sorts of folks that you want to have asking questions that are well versed on the topic. They understand that it's being taken seriously, and it's not a topic that deserves to be treated with ridicule or snickers, behind hands and into elbows and so on, So hopefully we'll see more questions asked over time, and they do have a bit more of a serious tone given to them as well.
Well, speaking of journalists, obviously, one of the most famous Australians of the last couple of years, normally you would say Steve Irwin, Crocodile Dundee, Nicole Kidman, Margot Robbie. I think I have to give a shout out these days. Ross Coulthart has thrown himself into the lexicon when you talk about famous Australians for the work he's done. Can I ask first, as an Australian, because that's the whole point of having you on here, you've got that perspective that isn't the US, the UK, the usual. How is Ross Coulthart viewed as a journalist in Australia, first and foremost?
Yes, I mean, I've known of Ross. I now know Ross, but I've known of Ross for many, many years. I mean, he is 60 Minutes Australia alumni. He's been with ABC Four Corners program, which is a news and current events and news program. So Ross has been on some of the most recognised and respected news and current events channels in Australia. Now he's with, more recently, Seven Spotlight, and he's done a number of documentaries, not just on the UAP topic, but he continues to do stories on big tobacco and other topics as well. And he's obviously he's the recipient of the Walkley Award a number of times. So I think he is, certainly from my perspective, he is well respected and well regarded, first and foremost, as an investigative journalist in his own right. And then for him to kind of burst onto the scene following the release of his book In Plain Sight, which I think is really wonderful, essential reading for anyone that is just new to the topic and is not. Yeah, and updated edition coming out pretty soon, so it'll be interesting to see what updates he's made to it. But to answer your question, prior to him entering the main stage on the UAP topic, I personally think he has been very well regarded and well respected on many topics from a journalistic standpoint, and that's not just me. That's my immediate family members and friends feel that. I know that he cops a bit of a rough trot on social media and tall poppy syndrome. When someone does well at anything, there's people that want to pull them down. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people on social media are saying, "Oh, where's the evidence? Show us the evidence." And they think they're entitled to some evidence that is just going to be thrown their way. But I understand where Ross is coming from a lot of the times. I mean, the reason why people go to Ross they entrust him with information is because they can trust him as someone that is going to protect their identity, protect them as a source. He's not going to go blabbing their identity to the world and reveal that information. So, Ross is kind of adhering to the golden rule of investigative journalism: is you protect your sources. You don't reveal your sources, because if you do, game over as an investigative journalism. No one's ever going to trust you again and come to you with information. So that's what he's doing first and foremost, is protecting his source and only revealing information that he is able to reveal that is not going to jeopardize the identity or the security or the well-being of a source. I get that. I understand that. I don't know why so many other people don't understand it. So, and unfortunately, we're not ever going to be in a position where we're going to have evidence spoon-fed our way or thrown our way, because we don't have we don't have a security clearance. We don't have any, top secret SCI clearance. We're just given basically the scraps of information that come our way. And unfortunately, I think that's how it is going to be until the day comes that maybe with this new legislation that Schumer is behind, with the UAP Disclosure Act and continued FOIA efforts, that we can have breadcrumbs revealed every now and then that reveal larger breadcrumbs that can help identify larger bread loaves and those sorts of things. That's an analogy that John Greenwald shared with me time and time again. So the notion that I think people are going to be going to get some big revelation of evidence, I don't think is ever going to happen outside of there being some unofficial disclosure or leak that is going to come out of someone in the intelligence community or that is in a position to know. I think people need to manage their expectations a little and understand that evidence, unfortunately, is only available to a select number that are privy to be read into that information, have a clearance, or they are trusted as an individual that's not going to reveal the identity of the source. So unfortunately that's the way it is.
Yeah, evidence is also subjective as well, because Ross Coulthart recently, and we're going to talk about the presentation he just done in Melbourne, but as part of the Q&A, and correct me if I get any of this wrong, because I'm just catching up on the second part of it. I believe you were there, weren't you, Grant, at the presentation?
I had the good opportunity of being there. It was really good.
So we'll come to that, right? So I believe one of the audience questions for the Q&A asked Ross, and he mentioned that he knew, was it the form of non-human intelligence? And it was asked a question like that, and he said, yes, I know the form it takes. And he said he can't go into more than that because of the reasons you say, and that was protecting sources and methods. He wants to get to a point where he can talk more about that. And I'm assuming when I hear something like that, he can come out and say, yes, we have a species coming from planet A to Earth in the form of this. Or he says it's something that is non-human, but it's robotic or clones. He maybe knows something a bit more than we do. Yeah, something like that. And this is just speculating. He's not said this, just to clear that up, but that's the idea he's giving, that he knows the form it's taken. People still won't be happy with that, like you say, because, well, we want evidence. So then Ross maybe says, okay, here is General Australian. He works in the Australian military. Here's who told me it. And then he comes forward and tells us, people will say, okay, now where did he get the evidence? And it's just that constant line, isn't it, of yeah, but, and people are never going to be happy at large. So it's a bit of a losing battle, isn't it, in terms of what evidence people find appropriate.
Yeah, that's right. I think we're all craving something that's tangible, and even if there is the revelation of evidence it's corroborative, it's verifiable. I still think you're going to have folks that, until the day comes that they can see it with their own eyes, they can touch it with their own hands, and it becomes tangible to them. I think it's going to remain that kind of an enigma for many people, because they believe it when they see it, sort of thing. And I'm again of the belief, like for me, I again try and stay very neutral, and I keep a very skeptical but yet open mind on the entire topic. So when I hear of the latest, greatest UFO or UAP footage or sighting that has been uploaded to social media, I take it with a grain of salt, because what about provenance? When was it taken? Who did it? Was it captured from? How was it captured? How was it disseminated? There are so many questions that need to be answered for me personally, before I can take some form of evidence that is presented seriously. So, and I think, rightly or wrongly, people will make their own conclusions as to what they're presented with. But for some people, that's not going to be enough. They'll just want more and more and more, to the point where it is so tangible for them that they can see it, touch it, taste it, smell it, whatever they're going to, whatever is going to get them across the line to satisfy their curiosity that this is legitimate, this is real. So different strokes for different folks, I guess. But I think it's for me to stay neutral and grounded, and let the data and the facts kind of lead the way. And that's why I really respect and applaud the work of Avi Loeb, and who I know you only just recently had on Galileo project. He's practicing what he's preaching. He's talking about science, and he's doing science. He's getting out there, and he's trying to have these expeditions where he can retrieve actual material and test it, analyze it, see if the results can be repeated. He's not just talking about it, he's actually doing it. And that's why I think it's important that folks like Avi Loeb are leading the charge on the topic from a scientific standpoint, because he is well respected, he's well regarded, and I think a lot of folks will follow his lead in the scientific and academic community when they start to see that he's not being ridiculed, or his career hasn't suffered as a result of the serious tone that he's taken with the topic. So I have a lot of time for Avi Loeb, and I respect the approach that he's taken to try and understand the nature of and extent of UAP, whatever UAP may be.
Yeah, of course. And do you think there's an element of, when it comes to evidence, that the slow build and slow reveal of things makes more sense over that kind of prolonged period of time? You think I remember watching the first Iron Man movie, not thinking that 20 movies down the line we were going to have the Infinity War and Endgame, and there would be this whole encapsulating story. But if at the end of Iron Man 1, when he says, I am Iron Man, the Russo brothers walk on screen and say, look, at the end of this, Thanos doesn't have the stones, Tony dies, and he snaps his fingers. Sorry, spoilers for Endgame there. Yeah. You've not had the context and the journey for all of what happens between that for you to feel and understand it and understand what's going on. And I think that's where I personally enjoy that element of the UFO topic, that you get slow releases and something else happens, and it's almost like that episodic TV show. It feels like it at the minute anyway, doesn't it? Where someone else comes out and you've got like a bit of a twist, and then you hear something else and you hear a new idea or a new opinion, and very slowly it starts to make sense. And you get folks who, and they're quite right to want this, that they want tomorrow someone to come out and say, here's the grey beings, here's the craft, and let's have a 1 hour talk on how all this came about. Maybe that slow burning realization and disclosure, confirmation, whatever you want to call it, is the right way to go. And I personally see that if that's what's going to happen, maybe that's what's playing out right now in front of us.
Yeah, I mean, if you kind of look at the parallels with, a show that we all were fans of growing up as kids, the X-Files, you'd have that recurring storyline over how many seasons that the X-Files ran, where it'd be the ET, the mystery of the black ooze, or whatever the subject line was. And that ran over several seasons. And I think that's also kind of playing out in what we're seeing since not just 2017, but I think 2017 was kind of that pivotal milestone for the topic, where we had such revelations and these bombshell articles come out in the New York Times, which understandably had some information in there what we now know was not factual or accurate and needed to be corrected. ATIP or SAP, 22 million, where did it go, and that sort of thing. But in the scheme of things, in the big picture, you look at everything that's happened since 2017. It's just been this progressive ramp up of information, activity, more and more important people and those within government, within military, the scientific community, taking the topic seriously. It kind of feels like it's that snow, that tiny ball of snow that's rolling down the hill, gradually getting greater speed and greater mass, and it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger until hopefully at some point there's a point of critical mass where more and more members of the general public get start to ask the questions that we're asking on this topic and get interested and start to ask questions of their elected representatives. So more and more people within the government start asking questions as well. I mean, that's the big challenge that we've had in Australia to date, is that there's only one Australian senator, Senator Peter Whish-Wilson, that has had the courage and gumption to ask questions on UAP in an Australian context. And that dates back to his engagement on this topic, dates back to October of 2021. And since that time, he's still, again, the only one that's asked questions. But you compare that to, say, the United States, look at all of the congressmen and women and representatives that have come out in support of this topic. You had Gillibrand and Rubio, but now look how many others that have come out support the topic. I mean, to Chuck Schumer, one of the most powerful political figures in government in the United States, and it seems like it's just continuing to. I mean, there's periods of ebb and flow where. And I've said this before, but Ross Coulthart, for many of us, is kind of a barometer. How he's feeling from week to week kind of sometimes gives us a sense as to where we might be headed next. But the needle is constantly changing from week to week. You get something new happens. There's a new drop. There's something. I mean, who saw the the UAP Disclosure Act coming. I mean, we in the general public didn't see that coming until it hit the it hit the main stage and was revealed to the world, and it was all over Twitter before you know it, and we're all talking about it. So it feels like there is this ongoing increase of information that's being pushed out in whether it's a drip feed fashion, whether that's by design and that's quite strategic, or if it just happens to be how it's playing out. Who knows? But I certainly feel, I mean, I said before, what an exciting time for us to be alive, for folks that take this topic seriously and are genuinely fascinated and interested by it. I mean, we've never been at this point in time on this topic than we have today. And that's an incredibly exciting time, but also an incredibly, privileged time to be alive and an interesting moment in our human history as well.
Absolutely. Always reminds me
no matter what UAP is.
Yeah, of course. And it reminds me of Doctor Who, one of the series where he talks about how we're living in the age of stars right now, and we're very fortunate to see the stars in the sky as we do, because one day, very, very long time away, there won't be any more stars in the sky, and the skies around the universe will be black. And I thought that was also nice. And like you say, we're fortunate to kind of live where we are at the moment in a very interesting time in social media, the internet. Click of a button, you've got all this content to consume or look at and information which people just didn't have in the past. What's been a recent moment with that kind of content was the presentation that happened out in Australia, in Melbourne. Do you want to talk about that? Because you were involved, you were there. Tell the listeners what happened.
Yeah, so I found out about it back in June. The event organisers, who Close Encounters Australia, they just run a YouTube channel, and they run a number of events. And they made me aware of it, so I put a post out on then Twitter, letting folks that follow my journey on the topic know about it. And I think, not as a result of my doing, but I think in only a matter of weeks or month after that event was advertised, again primarily through social media, that event sold out. So it kind of spoke to how much of a demand there is for people to actually hear from and see Ross in person, up close and personal, share again how his conversations and his breaking interview with David Grusch came to be, and also his foray into this topic, what got him interested in the topic and led him to investigating and documenting it all and in plain sight, and establishing a network of sources that he trusts and that trust him. And so it was a really good event for, I think, folks that one had just a curiosity and interest in the topic, but maybe aren't, again, as well versed in the topic as much as we are on social media every day. And kind of there, I think sometimes I'm probably spending a bit too much time on watching YouTube live streams and listening to podcasts and on Twitter, seeing what the latest updates are, because recently it feels like there's just so much going on. It almost is a full-time job to kind of stay up to date with what's going on the topic. So I think for folks that are new to the topic, it was a really good introduction, because Ross kind of recapped on some of the key core themes from In Plain Sight. But what I was really looking forward to and valued the most was the Q&A session, because Ross took questions for about a bit over 60 minutes from questions from folks that, again, were well-versed in the topic, those that maybe were new to the topic. And it was a really interesting and diverse mix of questions that he was asked on David Grusch about, not the Tic Tac, but the Alaska shoot down in Dead Horse, Alaska. He talked about that, and that it was a cylindrical object that resembled kind of a Tic Tac. So there was a few little tidbits that he released that I don't think he had shared previously. And obviously there's the patch that he introduced as well, which I know kind of blew up social media. But he was just putting out there and saying, this is information that was shared with me. Someone came forward to me and put this information in my hands. So here it is. Do with it what you will. Take it as it is, and make your own judgment. He wasn't he wasn't saying this is true, this is this is that. He was just putting it out there. So, but again, the Q&A was what I really valued the most, and for me, it was a nice opportunity to finally meet Ross in person, because I'd been engaged with Ross and a few other folks for over a year on email, on an email chain. So I just found it. I was grateful I had the opportunity to have a quick chat with him, privately, shake his hand, and say, thank you for all that you do to elevate the conversation on the topic. Because I feel that without Ross, perhaps we might not be as far down the rabbit hole as we are today, as we were, 5-6 years ago. I think we're in a fortunate position that there are folks like Ross who, those. Think of them what you will, but Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp, there are people that obviously trust both of them with their information, and they're willing to come forward and present them with their information, maybe out of frustration that their higher ups in the military aren't taking the topic seriously. So to Jeremy's credit, people are sharing with him some information that is legitimate and valid. So, with those folks, I think the conversation is it benefits from them being in the topic and community rather than not.
Yeah, and again, I got on well with Jeremy. I understand, and he knows some people don't like him or his approach. He has a huge following inside the UFO community, but also outside. He has a massive outreach, and that is a great platform to get information out there. Ross Coulthart has that now as well, with Bryce Sable and Need to Know. Obviously, you've got a bit of a power couple with Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp as well. That's it was two names when folks saw those get together as such. We were like, really? But it works. And I know a new Weaponized has just came out. I've not had a chance to watch it. And do you know what, Grant? I was really glad. I managed to watch the first part of the Ross Coulthart presentation through the web, the channel you mentioned, Close Encounters Australia. The link will be in the description for folks to go and check out. And it was nice to hear you get a mention and a shout out from Ross when we was on stage.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that. I mean, I had a chance to have a quick chat before Ross went on stage, and yeah, it was a nice surprise, and I was thrilled to get a little shout out from him, because it's always a sense of validation to a degree, that the interest that I have in the topic and the questions that I'm pursuing and trying to get answers to. The journey that I've taken and the efforts that I've undertaken is obviously appreciated, and it was nice for Ross to for him to say that when he didn't need to, and it was just really nice to meet so many other people at that event that I had not met in person, but I'd engaged with on social media, that are just everyday Aussies that, like me, are really curious and interested in the topic, and they wanted to see how they could help, how they could assist me, if I had some recommendations for them on how they can engage their elected representatives, what they can do to further the conversation with people that are in their community and family and friends. So it was nice to be able to put a lot of Twitter handles to a name and a face, and see people up close and personal, and still continue to have engagement with those folks since that event too. So I know there's quite a bit of interest for a comparable event to be held in Sydney. So I know that the event organisers were quite keen to see if that could be done. I know Ross said he was quite keen to do it, because there is just as much of an appetite for an event like that was in Melbourne in Sydney. So and I would say as well, going back to to Ross and to Jeremy, to their credit, again, irrespective of what you think of those gentlemen, they've done a great job on elevating the conversation on the topic in the mainstream media as well. Jeremy has been on some of the Brekkie Central morning shows here in Australia. I know Sunrise is one that he's been on, along with John Greenwald, and Ross has been on them as well. And so, kudos to the media in that respect. They're having these gents on that are concise and well-spoken, and they're articulate in how they can get their message across, and saying, well, this is a topic that's been taken seriously. This is why people need to pay attention.
100%. And just before we move on to the kind of last part of the conversation, I want to ask you, if Ross, just before he went on stage, said, Grant, you've done some amazing work. I really respect you, and I'm sure he does. I'm going to let you ask me one question, and just between us, I'm going to tell you the answer to it honestly. What would you have asked him?
Well, if it's between me and Ross, so I actually had Ross on my live stream, the Unexplained Rundown, not long ago with Bill Chalker and another gentleman who's on Reddit, who does a lot of good research. And Ross was talking about how he has had conversations with folks that are in the Australian Defence Special Forces that have been involved in crash retrieval programs. And I asked Ross the question, is that within Australia or is it abroad? And he wouldn't go into answering that question, understandably from the sources and methods perspective. But that would be a question that I would love to get pick his mind on. Is have there been any crash retrievals or active efforts in Australia on Australian soil to recover UAP? As that would be a question that I'd be very keen to get an answer on, because Australia is such a big place. There are so many places that you could hide some top secret tech here, and I imagine there is. I mean, you've got Pine Gap out in the Northern Territory and out Alice Springs, which people know very, very little about, jointly operated with the US and Australia. So, yeah, being such a large country, I'd love to know if there have been any what kind of UAP-related programs and crash retrieval programs have been happening on Australian soil.
Well, that leads me on very nicely, because my next question was about Australia. The landmass of the country is huge, and I always knew that, but I've now got family who have lived out in Sydney and moving to Brisbane now. They've been out there for almost 10 years, just over 10 years actually. A lot of folks might not realise that most of the population, most countries, the population resides along the coast and then moves inland, but Australia is very much resigned to the coast, isn't it? And there's 95% of the country is uninhabited. You have that mass of just nothing because of the heat, the lack of rainfall, when you've got like the outback and everything, where it's just a nothingness in the middle of the country. And I wonder, how do you think that unique geography in remote area might help or impact UFO sightings? But also, like you say, do you think there's a good chance that it's a good place for testing of secret equipment? If something went down, the odds are that no one would find it, see it or hear it, because it's so big as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think compared to the US, where it's such a densely populated country from the east to the west coast, like you said, Australia is completely opposite. We're really just isolated to the coastal fringes of the country, and you've got this massive landmass, and just in the center of the country is really just desert, sand, and it's uninhabited. So, I think. People often say, well, how come Australia doesn't have as many sightings as the US? Well, one, Australia doesn't have any reporting or recording protocols at the moment for the Australian Department of Defence. So, if you remember what Ryan Graves testified at the congressional hearing, he said in his assessment, and it was just his assessment, there's that about 5% is the reporting number. 95% of sightings are unreported. Australia doesn't have any reporting, so we're probably at zero. Nothing is getting reported. But you have folks like MUFON. There are other UAP UFO organizations that take reports from the general public, and there are a large number of reports for Australia. MUFON, for example, I reached out to the managing director of MUFON Australia and New Zealand, Roger Stankovic, and I inquired when I was doing some research initially. I said, well, how many Australian cases were submitted or sightings were submitted to MUFON between that comparable date range from when the UAP task force was was doing its preliminary assessment on UAP. They looked at a date range from about 2004 to 2021, and MUFON received about 1,158 cases or reports over that time range. Now, obviously, that's not nearly as big as maybe the caseload of the US, but that's pretty significant, and that's just from predominantly general public. So how much of it is, one, going unreported because there are no reporting mechanisms in place, and how many are just not being observed at all because of the fact that we're we're really a coastal country. We're isolated to the coastal fringes, where you have so much light pollution that you can't even see other than a couple of stars in the sky at night, unless you live out in the country and you're going to get a crystal night sky with those billions of stars, up above you. It's not surprising that you don't have a lot of sightings reported because of the fact that we're a smaller country. We're isolated to the coastal ranges. There really isn't the same reporting culture, I guess, in Australia as there is now in the United States. And so I think that all plays a part of it. And there's also certainly less of a nuclear element to it. We don't have, obviously we have, we're about to purchase 3 Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines from the United States as part of the AUKUS deal. But we don't have nuclear assets within Australia. We don't have nuclear weapons. So being that there is a nuclear connection with UAP, maybe that's another reason why there aren't as many cases or sightings reported near and around nuclear installations and nuclear assets like the Nimitz carrier group, like the nuclear attack submarines that the US have. So the US have a lot more toys. I'm sure they have a lot more top secret tech that they're working on, which gets misidentified as UAP. That's another element that you have to add into the mix when considering, what are Australians seeing and how frequently are they seeing it?
Something you touched on earlier, but you went past it. You were talking about, you sit rather centrally on the UFO topic and you allow your opinion to be fluid and change. And I think that's the right way to approach this subject. Do you have right now a hypothesis that if someone said to you, getting interested in the subject, Grant, what do you think this UFO phenomenon is? Is it alien beings coming from elsewhere? Is it interdimensional craft? Or what's your opinion right now?
Oh man, that's a tough one, because it changes daily. I mean, I do think that there is. Far out. I don't think it's one particular thing. I think it could be a combination of all of the potentially all of the hypotheses that have been thrown out there. I do think that there is black budget, top secret tech that certainly in the United States is being tested. That is being misinterpreted or misidentified as UAP. I without a doubt, I'm sure of that. I'm also confident that the UAP topic is being scapegoated to a degree to throw off, to misdirect our foreign adversaries. I'm sure that is also an element of it as well, to make our foreign adversaries think that we have something that is far more advanced and technologically superior than what they have, to keep our foreign adversaries guessing. To what extent that is a possibility, I don't know, but I'm sure it is a part of it in terms of any counterintelligence approach. And then you have the non-human intelligence aspect. I mean, extraterrestrially, you don't have to go back to 2004. If you go back, hundreds of years or even centuries ago, where even in Australia you have, cave art, rock carvings and paintings, these petroglyphs of what we would today associate as, ET or folks wearing, astronauts with spacesuits. I mean, there are things depicted in cave art from hundreds, if not thousands of years ago that depicts something odd that folks were obviously seeing in the skies in their day, and that became a part of their stories and traditions of sharing that information from generation to generation through Dreamtime and so on. So I think there is a component to this that goes a long ways back before Roswell and before the 1930s. I don't think UAP is just a modern phenomenon. I think it goes back a long, long time. But in conversations that I've have had with other folks, like Brad Voorhees of Sonic Gravity, he's very much invested in the idea that UAP could be future human. There could be an extra temporal element to this as well. And you have the interdimensional aspect, which David Grusch has kind of alluded to with his testimony and what he's said to date. And then you have the ultra terrestrial hypothesis that maybe we've shared this planet with folks, with other intelligences that we're only now starting to develop the technology to even detect them in the smallest possible sense. So of all of those things, which one is it? Oh shit, I have no idea. It could be many of them, but I certainly think there is a there to this topic. I in the back of my mind, I don't just think that it is nuts and bolts UAP that is man-made, is technology that we're trying to project the next, that's going to be released to the world 30 years down the road. I do think, just based on the sheer volume of people that have reported seeing something that they can't reconcile and explain, then you have the whole experiencer phenomenon to it as well. There is something to it that I think has more of a human man-made explanation to it. That's my inkling. I don't have any evidence, or I haven't seen anything to support that at this point in time. But that's kind of where my thinking is at.
No, thanks for that. And something you touched on, I was doing a little bit of research for this and some other stuff I'm doing, and I came across, it's in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute. It was a guy, Eric Saithre, from the University of Pretoria, wrote a journal about the Aboriginal Australian communities, and it was essentially a quick paragraph from it was, although UFOs, flying saucers and extraterrestrials are traditionally considered to be concepts associated with the West, Indigenous people are also familiar with these ideas. In a remote Aboriginal community in Central Australia, Warlpiri residents regularly cite and discuss UFOs. And again, it goes on to discuss that notion that, we've got Roswell, this, that, and the next thing. This goes back, like you say, hundreds of years. And we've heard about that. Even Indigenous folks in the US and elsewhere around the world seem to have more of a connection in spirituality and almost just like deep understanding that, yes, we are being visited or inhabited by something else. And they just accept that notion, as opposed to us in the West who struggle with it a bit more. So I'll put the link for that in the description as well for folks to have a look at. And just before we wrap up, Grant, I'd love to know, what are your kind of personal favourite cases? Maybe one or two you want to say that if anyone was looking at Australian UFO cases, what would you recommend?
Australian. Well, so most recently I had an opportunity, this is only a few months ago, back in April. Living in Melbourne, I'm about 50 minutes away from the site of the Westall flying saucer incident of the 6th of April, 1966. And I learnt through Shane Ryan, who has been the lead researcher on the Westall incident for many, many, many years, and I've seen him on your show, and I watched that interview with great interest. He told me about a witness reunion event that is done pretty much on an annual basis, and COVID put a bit of a spanner in the works. But there is a witness reunion event at the Grange, and for those of your listeners that folks that watch that don't know, on the 6th of April 1966 at Westall High School, several hundred school children and several teachers as well witnessed in the skies above their school between 1 and 3. There's a discrepancy as to the total number, but what quite a large number of folks reported as seeing a flying saucer in shape hover and move in the skies above Westall High School and then descend to a wooded area known as the Grange, about a kilometre or a couple of k's away from the school. And it either made contact with the ground, it either landed or descended and hovered on the ground. So I had an opportunity to meet face-to-face some of these primary witnesses, folks that are now in their 60s and 70s, that were only 12, 13 years of age, 16 years of age when that happened on the 6th of April 1966. And one that was the first opportunity that I had to actually meet a number of primary witnesses from a case that is as renowned as the Westall Incident, that many people, comparable to, I guess, the Ariel school sighting to agree, with so many children that had seen something. And they saw something. What they saw, I don't know because I wasn't there, but to then have the primary witnesses lead myself and many other members of the general public that were just interested in the case to the alleged landing site of the Westall flying saucer was really just an incredible experience. I mean, it was quite heart pounding, as well as, it's kind of like waking up on Christmas morning as a young boy. You're just so excited because someone that's interested in this topic like we are, it's just something we're so fascinated by, and it's such a fantastical event. So that incident, I had an opportunity to meet those folks face to face, and many of them were very generous and gracious of their time and willing to go on camera. So I spent pretty much half the day with them, just asking them questions on camera. And then I was able to put together a kind of a short documentary video that sharing their commentary and their retelling of their accounts of that day in as much as I could an unedited format, because the Westall incident has been covered in obviously James Fox's The Phenomenon. Shane Ryan did a wonderful documentary called Westall 66, a suburban UFO mystery. Wonderful viewing if anyone is interested in the Westall incident. Ross Coulthart's covered it on his 7 Spotlight specials as well. So, but a lot of those documentaries only had very short edited pieces from those witnesses. So I felt privileged that I was in a position to put all of their commentary in an unedited format into this video that kind of introduced those that aren't familiar with the Westall incident to that particular case, and also trying to explore some of the prosaic explanations that have been offered. Keith Basterfield, who's a wonderful veteran researcher in Australia, he presented a hypothesis that, well, maybe it was a high-altitude balloon, a high bal, but there has never been any documentary evidence located or presented that has supported that hypothesis, or anything that has supported it being a UAP or a flying saucer as well. And that's what's so frustrating about the Westall incident, that 57 years later, there has never, ever been any form of official explanation offered by the Australian government at a federal, state or local level. There's been no documentation that's ever seen the light of day regarding the event. And I've gone after documentation from NASA, from the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, through the Office of Naval Research. I know Shane Ryan's done much, much more on the FOIA front than I have. And there was this rumor that the Department of Supply conducted this very comprehensive investigation of the Westall incident, but 57 years later, those records are yet to see the light of day. They've either been destroyed or they've been hidden, and they're not going to be revealed anytime soon. So the fact that the Westall incident, there has never been any official record or document presented as to what Westall was or wasn't, keeps it a complete mystery to this very day. Because if it was something that was simply prosaic, like a high altitude balloon or a meteorological balloon, you would think that 57 years after the fact that there would be some form of documentation that would come forward saying, well, it might have been something that was top secret back then, but 57 years later, that technology is now, no longer, it's rudimentary, it's not relevant. But nothing has seen the light of day 57 years later. And I think that's the frustration for a lot of the primary witnesses, or at least the sense that I got from them is they're not so worried about what it is they saw, but the fact that they were told to shut up about it and not talk about it is what has kept them frustrated and angry to a point after all these years, that they were told never to speak of it. I want to know what was responsible for the Westall incident, but more importantly, I want to know why it was covered up. And so that's what I got into in the little video documentary that I put together, and had that good fortune of meeting some of the primary witnesses firsthand. So that is certainly the case that has captured my fascination and interest most recently. Yeah.
And just before I ask you to share where folks can find that and the Unexplained Rundown, really importantly, you've actively engaged politicians on this matter in Australia. What sort of success have you had? And do you want to give a little shout to listeners here? Because the fourth biggest listenership for this podcast is folks out in Australia. So hello to all of you. What would you say to anyone listening to this who might think, do you know what, I'd love to engage a local politician? How do I do that?
Yeah, and I remember I was like a lot of folks that maybe are watching this from down under. I was, where you are maybe now, and I didn't know what to do. Who should I reach out to? How do I contact my my elected representative? So I really just took it upon myself to jump on Google, type in "contact my member of parliament or senator," and you'll be taken to the Australian Parliament House website, where there are some very relatively straightforward step-by-step instructions on how you can engage your member of parliament or your senator. And that's exactly what I did. It was following the efforts of, the Big Phone Home, which was a really wonderful activism event that got me inspired to get off my ass and get in the game and reach out to my elected representatives. And that's what I did. I wrote letters, I emailed them. Some of them were on Twitter. I tweeted at them. I had some never replied, and that's to be expected. So you'll have some successes and some that don't bother to respond. But I was fortunate enough to foster ongoing engagement and a relationship with Senator Peter Whish-Wilson of Tasmania, who again is the only senator that has taken this topic seriously and asked questions in Australian Parliament. So I've been fortunate in that I've been able to provide Senator Whish-Wilson with information that has informed his lines of inquiry at the Senate estimates hearing that he's asked questions about UAP to the Australian Department of Defence, namely the Chief of Air Force, because a lot of senators and members of parliament, they've got so many other topics that are important to their constituents. They don't have the same time or invest the same amount of energy and effort as maybe we do to research this topic or really, dive into the weeds. So I was in a position where I was able to put forward almost about 30 questions to Senator Whish-Wilson, submit it to his office, and to my surprise and I guess delight, at the Senate estimates hearing on the 9th of November of last year, he had about 8 minutes to ask questions of the Chief of Air Force, Air Marshal Robert Chipman. And every single question that he asked were questions that I had authored, I had drafted and submitted to him for his consideration. So I don't say that to impress your audience but really to impress upon them that if you engage your elected representative on this topic and you make them aware of the fact, understand how important this topic is to you, and that you want them to take it seriously as their constituent, then your engagement with that elected representative can potentially help inform their thinking and lines of inquiry that they may take on the topic. They may make further inquiries internally. They may reach out to Senator Whish-Wilson. They may ask questions at a Senate estimates if they're on a particular committee. So if you are persistent enough and consistent in your persistence to engage your elected representatives, you can really help move the ball along and get some questions asked of those that are in positions of leadership in defence and in government. Because unfortunately, Senator Whish-Wilson can't do it all on his own. So the more Australians that engage their elected representatives on the topic and get them aware of what is going on, in the United States, that this is taken seriously as a national security and safety flight risk, I hope that you'll have more politicians in Australia start to take this topic seriously and follow Senator Whish-Wilson's lead on the topic. So that would be my recommendation. Just, make a phone call, write, email, send a text. If folks aren't sure how to start off that correspondence, they're certainly welcome to engage me directly on X or on Twitter. I just go by the handle @Grant Lavac. I actually have some good resources on my YouTube channel as well, The Unexplained Rundown, or if you just search for my name, Grant Lavac. I cover quite extensively, what is Australia doing about UAP and how folks can engage their elected representatives on the topic. Not only their elected representatives, but also the news media as well. You're following the Q&A event that Ross Coulthart did in Melbourne. A number of folks that I met at that event, we all formed part of joined a Facebook group, and we made a very collective and strategic effort to write to the media, to the mainstream media, and demand that they cover this topic with the respect that it deserves and take it seriously, and do away with the X-Files theme at the front end of everybody segment, and start asking some serious questions of people in positions of leadership in the Australian government and Department of Defence. Because sadly, the news media in Australia is only covering the topic from a US standpoint. They're not asking, well, why is Australia not taking the topic seriously? Has the Australian Minister for Defence engaged with discussions with his counterpart, the Secretary of Defence, Lloyd Austin, on UAP? And he's had 5 engagements in the last 12 months, and UAP has never come up in discussion. So the media are not asking these questions. We need to demand that they take this topic seriously. And if more and more people do that, I think there'll start to be a point of critical mass where they realise that this is a topic that our viewers and readers want to hear more about and for us to take seriously. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's essentially what I've done and advocate for people to do.
No, that's well put. And all those links to how to find you, how to find the channel are in the description for the show as well. And for me, Grant, a thank you and a well done, because you do put a lot of work in, and you're one of the Twitter accounts I look for and go and find out, because I'm like, Australian stuff, go to Grant. Not even just that, you follow all the US stuff and that around the world well as well. So thank you very much on behalf of me. And like I say, other listeners out in Australia, get involved, get in touch with Grant, and do some work, and maybe we can get this worldwide phenomena kicked up a gear as well, because like you say, when the news kind of falls away in the US, it certainly goes away everywhere else as well. So well done, yep. Grant, and great having you on.
Thanks, Andy. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to talk with you, and thanks for the opportunity to share some insights with your listeners. So many thanks.
That is all for this week's show. Thank you very much for listening. Please remember to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. You can like, retweet, and subscribe. That would all be very much appreciated. The shows are being uploaded onto YouTube as we speak more and more. You can sign up at patreon.com/That UFO podcast to access the shows ad-free as well. Please get in touch on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, That UFO Podcast. Of course, on Twitter, it's at UFO UAPAM. And again, folks, as always, keep looking up. You never know what you might see.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little Baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked a little around. Meditative game of state full on meta. I can't imagine how it could have been any better. I got to the top of the stairs and there he was. Like, you awake? I was about to abduct you, cuz. I jumped back and nearly kissed myself, and I climbed out the window after the elf, and I woke up in my bed and there was something on my head, and everything was weird and everything was red. And I called out to my boys. They thought this was noise. They thought it was a dream. They thought it was my toys. They thought it was my problems, and they think I should seek therapy, and I don't know what to do because it doesn't really scare me. If you really want to know who I think I be, I think it's you and me and us and we and him and her and that and she and that thing over there and what's that, Jake? But for being serious, open your mind, consider your heart, consider time, consider your space, consider your lies, consider your life, consider your eyes. It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer. What's that in the It wasn't a tic tac and not quite a saucer.